The Nash Executioner. Maybe the most common skateboard of the 1980s. If you didn't own one, you definitely knew somebody who did. My recent Variflex video struck a nerve, and in well over 1,000 comments, one name seemed to pop up more than any other, the Nash Executioner, even topping the Variflex Voodoo. And there was a pattern in those comments. People kept saying things like, I would have been lucky to have a Variflex. I had a Nash and it was way worse. And that's when it hit me, was the Executioner really the most common starter board of the 80s? Or does it just feel that way because so many people mention it now? After going through those comments, exploring massive threads on Facebook groups, and now digging through the actual business history, I think the answer's clear. The Executioner really was that common. It was everywhere, and obviously not because it was the coolest board, but because Nash was at one point the world's largest skateboard manufacturer. What really surprised me was that Nash wasn't a short-lived toy brand at all. It was a family business that started in 1918, made it through the Depression, reinvented itself with water skis in the 50s, and kept rolling through the skateboard booms of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. One of their early boards is even in the Smithsonian, and at their peak, they were making hundreds of thousands of skateboards until a fire in 2006 brought it all to an end. So this is the story of Nash Manufacturing, from a Texas hardware store to the most common skateboard in America, and how a single fire pretty much ended a nearly century-old business. Okay, so Nash Manufacturing didn't start with skateboards. The company traces back to 1918 when the Nash family founded Nash Hardware Company in Fort Worth, Texas. For decades, they sold tools, fishing tackle, and sporting goods, a typical family hardware business. But in the 1950s, fourth-generation family member Charles Nash III got bored with the hardware trade. He was passionate about water skiing, so in his garage, Charles and his wife Winnell started crafting their own water skis. That garage experiment became Nash Manufacturing Company in the early 1960s. And the timing couldn't have been better. Right as Charles was launching his new sporting goods venture, America's first skateboard craze exploded. In 1963 and 64, skateboarding went from a California novelty to a national phenomenon. Nash jumped in immediately, mass-producing simple wooden sidewalk surfer boards at their Fort Worth plant. Here's what set Nash apart from day one. They weren't trying to be a core skate brand. They were going straight for the mass market. While surf shops in California sold premium boards, Nash struck deals with Sears, JCPenney, and Montgomery Ward. Their boards appeared in catalogs coast to coast. Between 1960 and 1965, the US skateboard industry sold an estimated 50 million boards, and Nash sold tens of thousands of them, priced around $6 to $12 when premium boards cost much more. When skateboarding's first boom crashed in the late 60s, most skateboard companies folded, but Nash survived because they had diversified. Water skis, scooters, sleds, outdoor toys. The hardware business foundation kept them alive. Then in the 70s, urethane wheels revived skateboarding, and Nash was perfectly positioned. By 1978, Nash was running magazine ads claiming to be the world's largest water ski and skateboard manufacturer. And that wasn't just marketing hype, they really were producing massive volumes. One of Nash's earliest skateboards, the Goofy Foot Sidewalk Surfer, even sits in the Smithsonian Institution today as a piece of skateboarding history. Charles Nash III had turned his family's modest hardware store into a manufacturing powerhouse with national distribution, and by the time the 1980s boom hit, Nash was already everywhere. Nash Manufacturing was absolutely dominating the Toy-Aisle skateboard market. While brands like Powell, Vision, and Santa Cruz fought for sales in skate shops, Nash owned Toys R Us, Kmart, Target, and Walmart. And they weren't alone in those aisles. Variflex was right there too, but even in the toy aisle, there was a pecking order and Nash was totally at the bottom. Variflex, as we talked about in the last video, had actually started with a legit pro team in the late 70s and early 80s before shifting to department stores. They still made some decent boards like the XP Series Voodoo that at least felt closer to real skateboards, but Nash had never pretended to be anything but a mass market toy. They undercut everyone with cheaper wood, heavier decks, and more plastic parts. To parents shopping at Kmart, a Nash and a Variflex looked the same. To skaters, Nash was the bottom rung. If a parent in middle America wanted to buy their kid a skateboard, they were probably looking at a Nash. Okay, so the Executioner was their flagship model. The graphic is burned into the brain of anyone who was there. A dragon rising out of a pile of skulls, plastered across neon decks, radioactive green, hot pink, safety orange. It looked like a metal album cover, and to a 10-year-old, that made it irresistible. The specs tell you everything about Nash's strategy. The deck was about 29 inches long, it was close to 10 inches wide with a shallow kicktail and a mostly flat profile, no real concave, and some even say it felt slightly convex. The trucks were basic metal XR2s with stiff bushings that made turning a challenge. And the bearings, Nash actually advertised them as noise tested, which sounds impressive to a kid but means absolutely nothing. Combined with the deck weight, acceleration felt like pushing a brick. And man, it was heavy. Nash boards came loaded with plastic accessories, full-length rails, nose guards, tail guards, sometimes truck copers and lappers, all screwed on right out of the box to make them look pro and survive driveway abuse. Those parts made the boards maybe a little more durable, but they also made them clunky. So what did it feel like to ride? In the comments, people said it best, like pushing a sled. Heavy as a brick, but it got me hooked. I would have been lucky to get a Variflex instead of a Nash. That last comment says it all. Even Variflex, which core skaters dismissed as a toy store board, was a step up from Nash. But here's the thing, Nash sold like crazy. At their peak in the mid-80s, Nash boards were in thousands of retail locations nationwide. While exact sales figures are hard to confirm for the private company, their claim of being the world's largest skateboard manufacturer suggests they were moving hundreds of thousands of boards throughout the decade. Charles Nash III later said he was amazed to find himself considered famous in the California boarding community, not because his boards were good, but because they got so many kids skating. So yeah, that was Nash's entire business model, not performance, but presence, be everywhere, be affordable, look exciting enough to make a kid's eyes light up on Christmas morning. But by the late 1980s and early 90s, skateboarding was changing in ways Nash couldn't follow. Street skating took over, skaters wanted lighter decks, real concave, responsive trucks, and smooth bearings. Companies like World Industries, Plan B, and Blind were redefining what a skateboard should feel like. Nash stayed Nash, same heavy deck, same cheap components, same toy aisle positioning, and as skateboarding matured from a toy into a legitimate sport, the market for beginner boards shrank. Kids who got serious about skating would save up for a real setup. Younger kids moved on to inline skates and scooters in the 90s. Nash tried to adapt by leaning harder into their other product lines. They never stopped making water sports equipment, and in the 80s and 90s, their Hydroslide kneeboard brand became hugely successful. They also expanded into pool floats under the Margaritaville brand. They had coolers and other leisure products too. By the 2000s, Nash Manufacturing was essentially a water sports and outdoor recreation company that still made a few skateboards on the side. The company had survived for nearly a century by adapting from hardware to water skis to skateboards to kneeboards, but in 2006, adaptation wouldn't be enough. So in the summer of 2006, a massive fire broke out at their Fort Worth factory. By the time firefighters extinguished it, the facility was totally destroyed. All of Nash's molds, materials, and machinery, everything they used to make skateboards, water skis, kneeboards, and other products were lost. The cause of the fire was never conclusively determined. What was clear is that this single event effectively ended Nash Manufacturing's operations. After producing goods in Fort Worth since the 1960s, my understanding is that the company could no longer really manufacture anything. The Nash family chose not to rebuild. Charles Nash III was in his 70s and the cost of starting over was simply too much. The company limped along for a few years, managing remaining inventory and brand assets, but production had stopped. Charles Nash III passed away in August 2015 at age 82, and then 2 years later, in September of 2017, O'Brien Watersports acquired pretty much all of Nash's remaining assets, including the Hydroslide brand, the Margaritaville product line, and then the Sub-Z cooler line. Keith Parton, who was Nash's president, said at the time, "It has been a great 50 years at Nash," and then that was it. Nearly a century of family business ended by a fire and closed with an asset sale. So what's the legacy of Nash Manufacturing? From a business perspective, it's a story of remarkable adaptation. A family hardware store in 1918 became a water ski manufacturer in the 1950s, then the world's largest skateboard maker in the 1970s and 80s, and finally a diversified sporting goods company in the 90s and 2000s. They rode multiple boom and bust cycles and survived for nearly 90 years. From a skateboarding perspective, Nash's legacy is more complicated. They never had a pro team, they never innovated deck shapes or truck technology, they never made contest podiums, core skaters called them poser boards, and the Executioner came shorthand for cheap department store junk. But here's the interesting part, one of Nash's earliest skateboards sits in the Smithsonian. That's not an honor given to just anything, that's recognition of historical importance. Nash may not have pushed skateboarding forward as a sport, but they were pioneers in making it accessible to the masses. And here's what really matters, Nash introduced more people to skateboarding than probably any other brand in history. If you were a kid in middle America in the 1980s and you wanted a skateboard, Nash was often the only option your parents could afford. And for every kid who quit because their Nash felt like a brick, there's another who fell in love with skating and eventually upgraded to a real board, but only because the Executioner was there first. That's the gateway board thesis. Nash didn't make pros, Nash made skaters. And today there's a strange irony playing out. The same boards kids mocked as Kmart specials in 1986 now sell for hundreds of dollars in collector groups. An Executioner in decent shape with original rails and guards is genuinely hard to find because most were ridden to death or tossed when the kids upgraded. The cheapest board of the 80s is now too expensive for me to justify as buying a prop for this video. So yeah, time has a sense of humor. So what about you? Did you have a Nash? Was it the Executioner, the Nightmare, or one of the other wild graphics? And maybe do you remember the exact color or the Christmas morning? Drop your story in the comments. I'm building a whole archive of these gateway board memories. And this is officially a series now. Part 1 was Variflex. This was part 2, Nash. Part 3 is coming soon, Volterra, the Marty McFly board timed with Madrid's re-release. If you grew up in the 80s, you know that one's gonna be special. All right, thanks for watching. I'm Matt, and I'll see you in the next one.